So here's something that might surprise you as you're settling in for the night. For most of early American history, Christmas wasn't actually a federal holiday. The Puritans banned it, politicians worked through it. And the White House? Well, it didn't even exist for the first president's entire term. But over the past 200 and some years, something interesting happened. Presidents, these people managing wars and depressions and crises that would break most of us, still found ways to celebrate Christmas. They hung stockings for their dogs. They painted cards by hand. They read stories to children. They smuggled forbidden trees into closets. They tried, in their own complicated human ways, to create moments of warmth in the coldest of times. Tonight, we're going to explore 14 of the most heartwarming Christmas stories from US presidents throughout history. Real stories, verified facts, no myths, no legends, just the strange, touching, oddly comforting truth about how the most powerful people in America celebrated the holidays. So get comfortable, maybe grab a blanket, and let's talk about presidential Christmases, starting with a man who kept meticulous records of his Christmas gifts, including fabric and fish. Washington's Christmas gifts to workers at Mount Vernon. So here's the thing about George Washington that nobody really tells you when you're learning about wooden teeth and cherry trees in elementary school. The man kept detailed records of absolutely everything. And I mean everything. What he ate for breakfast, how much it rained on Tuesday, the exact inventory of his wine cellar, and yes, what he gave people for Christmas. You're probably imagining something grand and dramatic, right? The father of our country bestowing elaborate presents in some colonial version of Oprah's favorite things. But no, this is the 1700s, and George Washington is essentially running a small village at Mount Vernon, which means Christmas generosity looks more like fabric and fish, sometimes a little bit of money. Stay with me here, this gets more interesting. Every December, Washington would distribute gifts to the enslaved people who worked his plantation. Now, let me be clear about something before you start feeling too warm and fuzzy. This wasn't altruism in the way we understand it today. This was part of a paternalistic system designed to maintain control while acknowledging a holiday that mattered to people. But within that deeply flawed framework, Washington's account books reveal something oddly human. He would give out lengths of cloth for new clothes, extra food rations, sometimes coins. In 1786, he purchased several pounds of sugar specifically to distribute at Christmas. In 1791, he bought stockings for the children. The account books from Mount Vernon are almost hypnotic to read, if you're the kind of person who finds 18th century ledgers soothing, which at this hour you might be. They list things like, to cash paid for sundries given to at Christmas, followed by amounts that seem impossibly small now but represented something in that moment. Sometimes it was fabric imported from England, Osnaburg for work clothes, the occasional piece of linen for someone's Sunday best. Here's what makes this particularly strange to think about. Washington was meticulous about these distributions, partly because he saw them as necessary for maintaining morale, but also because he seemed to understand that Christmas meant something, that even in the worst circumstances, people wanted that one day to feel different. The records show he'd sometimes give extra portions of meat, barrels of herring, or permission to hold dances and celebrations. Christmas Eve and Christmas Day were typically free from field work. There's this one entry from 1792 where he notes purchasing toys for the children. Just that one line in his expense book, no elaboration. But you can imagine what that meant. In a world where childhood for enslaved children was brutally short, where play was a luxury most couldn't afford, someone decided that on Christmas there should be toys. Wooden figures maybe. Simple dolls. Something to hold on to for one morning. Washington also had a tradition of hosting Christmas dinner for his own family that stretched over multiple days, which sounds exhausting, but was apparently standard for wealthy Virginians who had nothing better to do than eat constantly and complain about British policy. But on Christmas Day specifically, there'd be distributions around the plantation before the Washington family sat down to their own feast of roasted meat and approximately 73 different pies. The interesting part, and this is where Washington's obsessive record keeping becomes genuinely valuable, is that you can track how these distributions changed over the years. They got slightly more generous as he got older, more variety, more attention to individual needs. In later years, the records show gifts tailored to specific people: warm stockings for the elderly, extra cloth for mothers with new babies, a little more money for the skilled craftsmen. Was this enough? Obviously not. Was it complex and morally fraught? Absolutely. But it's part of the real story of how Christmas was actually celebrated in early America before it became the commercial juggernaut we know today. It was quieter, more practical, sometimes just a few extra ounces of sugar and permission to rest. And here's the thing that might help you drift off. Imagine Mount Vernon on a cold December evening in the 1780s, the Potomac River probably frozen at the edges, wood smoke rising from chimneys across the estate, candles being lit in windows, and someone, somewhere on that property, opening a package with just enough fabric to make a new shirt, thinking about the one day of the year when the rhythm of endless work paused, just slightly. Washington himself would spend Christmas Day greeting visitors, carving meat at dinner, probably wearing something uncomfortably formal because that's just what he did. But somewhere in his careful mind was that ledger, those lists, the awareness that he'd distributed gifts across his estate. Not enough to change anything fundamental, but enough to acknowledge that this day mattered. That even in an imperfect world, and Lord knows his world was imperfect, there could be moments of deliberate kindness. The records stop, of course, when he dies in December 1799, 1 week before Christmas, his final December. But those account books remain, preserved in archives, each line a small window into how one complicated person tried to observe a holiday within an unconscionable system. It's the contradictions that make history hard to sleep through sometimes, isn't it? The good and the terrible existing simultaneously, but understanding both is what makes it real. And real history, even when it's messy, even when it makes you uncomfortable, is what we're here for tonight. But speaking of early Christmases in uncomfortable situations, let's talk about what happened when someone decided to move into a house that wasn't quite finished yet. John and Abigail Adams' humble first Christmas in the unfinished White House. Okay, so picture this. It's late November in the year 1800, and Abigail Adams, brilliant, sharp-tongued, absolutely done with everyone's nonsense, is traveling from Massachusetts to the new capital city of Washington. She's on her way to meet her husband John in this building everyone keeps calling the president's house, except nobody's really sure if it's ready for actual humans to live in yet. Spoiler alert, it is not. Abigail arrives to find what can only be described as a very expensive construction site. The house is enormous, sure, but enormous in the way a cave is enormous. Lots of space, questionable functionality. Plaster still wet on the walls. Only 6 rooms are even remotely habitable. No bells to call servants, so everyone has to physically walk around this massive building shouting for each other like they're playing the world's most frustrating game of Marco Polo. And the staircases? The main staircase isn't even installed yet. They're using a temporary one. The house has 36 rooms total, but most are empty shells filled with sawdust and carpenter's debris, and probably a few confused pigeons. But here's what makes this perfect for our purposes tonight. The Adamses are about to experience their first Christmas in this half-finished mansion, and they're going to do it with the kind of pragmatic resignation that only people who've survived a revolution can muster. The East Room, which today is this grand space where presidents hold fancy receptions, is completely unfinished in 1800. So Abigail, because she's not about to let good drying space go to waste, hangs her laundry there. That's right. The First Lady of the United States is using the future center of American diplomatic hosting to dry her stockings. There's something deeply comforting about that image. The most powerful couple in the young nation, and they're dealing with wet laundry just like everyone else. December 1800 in Washington is cold, like properly cold, and the president's house has exactly 0 functioning fireplaces yet. Actually, that's not quite true. Some fireplaces work, but the wood is so green and unseasoned that the fires smoke terribly and don't provide much heat. Abigail writes letters to her daughter describing how they're constantly cold. She mentions needing fires in 3 different rooms just to keep one corner of the house tolerable. This is not the glamorous presidential existence you might imagine. Christmas Day that year falls on a Thursday. John Adams is 65 years old, exhausted from a brutal election that he knows he's lost to Thomas Jefferson, and he's basically counting down the days until he can leave this drafty nightmare and go back to Massachusetts. Abigail is 56 and probably thinking very pointed thoughts about the people who assured her this house would be ready. They don't throw a party. There's no grand celebration. Historical records suggest they spent Christmas quietly, probably with a few members of their household staff, certainly without the elaborate entertaining that would come to characterize White House Christmases in later years. They eat dinner, roasted meat probably, vegetables from the limited supplies available in this swampy new city that's still mostly mud and mosquitoes. Maybe there's a small exchange of gifts between family members, though nothing is documented. Here's what we do know from Abigail's letters. She's lonely. Washington, the city, barely exists yet. It's not connected to the established social networks of Philadelphia or Boston. There are very few women of her social class to visit with. The house is isolating in its emptiness. So Christmas 1800 is probably quiet in a way that's both peaceful and a little bit sad. The kind of quiet where you're very aware of everyone who isn't there. John Adams is dealing with his own melancholy that December. He's the first president to lose re-election. His son, Charles, has just died from alcoholism at age 30, and the news reaches John right around this time. The political attacks against him have been vicious. This is the era of newspapers calling presidents every insult imaginable, and John Adams has been called plenty. So his first and only Christmas in the White House is colored by grief, defeat, and the knowledge that he'll be moving out in just a few months. But here's the thing that makes this story actually heartwarming. In a strange, historical way, they manage. Abigail keeps writing letters full of dry humor about their situation. She complains, yes, the woman is not shy about describing exactly how inconvenient everything is, but she also notes small beauties. The view from certain windows, the potential she can see in the house once it's finished, the hope that future families will have it better. And John, despite everything, keeps working. Christmas Day or not, there are papers to review, decisions to make. He's living in this cold, unfinished monument to a nation that's still figuring itself out, and he shows up anyway. Gets out of bed in the freezing house. Does the job until his very last day in office. There's something almost cozy about their situation if you squint at it the right way. Here are 2 people who've been married for decades, who've survived revolution and political chaos, and the death of children, spending a quiet Christmas in a house that's not quite ready for them. No pressure to be festive, no expectations of grandeur, just the 2 of them, some cold rooms, drying laundry in the East Room, and the simple fact of being together at the end of a very long year. Abigail writes that she hopes the house will bring happiness to future occupants, that despite its current state, she can imagine it filled with warmth and life someday. And she's right, of course. But on that first Christmas in 1800, warmth is mostly theoretical, and life is very, very quiet. They leave the White House on March 4th, 1801, probably grateful to escape. But that one Christmas they spent there, cold, humble, uncelebrated, might be the most honest Christmas any president ever had in that building. No pageantry, no performance. Just two exhausted people making it through December in a house that represented a country still under construction. Which break night, when you think about it at 2 in the morning when you can't sleep, is kind of everything America was at that moment. Unfinished, drafty, full of potential, making do. But if you think one quiet Christmas was touching, wait until you hear about the president who spent 4 consecutive Christmases during the nation's bloodiest war. Lincoln's Christmas Letters of Comfort. During the Civil War, let me tell you something about Abraham Lincoln that might surprise you. The man was a compulsive letter writer. Not in a casual, hey, how are you, okay bye kind of way. In a thoughtful, deliberate, agonizingly careful kind of way. He'd revise letters multiple times, write drafts, think about every single word, which becomes particularly important when we talk about the letters he wrote around Christmas during the Civil War. Picture Lincoln in the White House in December of 1863. The war has been raging for over 2 years. The Battle of Gettysburg happened in July, over 50,000 casualties. The preliminary Emancipation Proclamation was issued the previous January. By this point, Lincoln is personally aware that hundreds of thousands of young men have died in a war he's leading, and that knowledge sits on him like a physical weight. People who saw him during these years said he looked exhausted in a way that went beyond tired, haunted maybe, old beyond his 54 years. Christmas during the Civil War was complicated. Soldiers in camps would try to celebrate. Confederate and Union troops sometimes declaring informal truces on Christmas Day, sharing food across battle lines, singing carols that both sides knew. But in Washington, in the White House, Christmas was quieter. The Lincolns had lost their son Willie in February of 1862, and Mary Lincoln never really recovered. She couldn't bear to celebrate much of anything after that. So Christmas in the Lincoln White House was subdued at best. But here's where it gets interesting for our purposes. Lincoln spent parts of his Christmas seasons writing letters to people who'd lost loved ones in the war. Not form letters, not generic condolences, actual personal letters that took him considerable time and emotional energy to compose. The most famous of these is the Bixby letter, written in November of 1864 to Mrs. Lydia Bixby, who was believed to have lost 5 sons in the war. The letter is remarkably short, just a few lines, but every word feels like it was carved out of stone. I feel how weak and fruitless must be any word of mine which should attempt to beguile you from the grief of a loss so overwhelming, he writes. Think about that phrasing. He's the president, commander-in-chief. He could have written something official and moved on. Instead, he's admitting that words are inadequate, that he knows nothing he says will actually help, but he's saying something anyway because silence would be worse. Now, there's some historical controversy about whether Mrs. Bixby actually lost all 5 sons. Records suggest maybe only 2 died in combat, and the family situation was complicated. But what matters for us lying here at whatever hour you're listening to this is that Lincoln believes she'd lost 5 sons, and he sat down, probably late at night because that's when he did his most important writing, and tried to find words for that level of loss. He wrote other letters too around Christmas and throughout the war years, letters to mothers, widows, orphans. In December of 1862, he wrote to Fanny McCullough, the daughter of a friend who'd been killed in battle. You are sure to be happy again, he tells her. To know this, which is certainly true, will make you some less miserable now. I have had experience enough to know what I say. You can feel his own grief in those lines. His experience with the death of Willie, his understanding that pain doesn't vanish, but it does eventually become something you can carry. The thing about Lincoln's Christmas letters is that he never pretends the grief is acceptable or that death in war is noble in some uncomplicated way. He doesn't offer easy comfort. He acknowledges that the losses are devastating, that nothing makes them okay, that platitudes are useless, but then he offers something else. Not hope, exactly, but maybe solidarity. The sense that someone in power is actually aware of the cost, that the president himself is staying up late thinking about your dead son by name. Christmas 1864 is particularly poignant. By this point, Lincoln has been reelected, which he didn't expect. The war is clearly moving toward a Union victory, but it's not over yet, and men are still dying every day. Sherman has just taken Savannah and sent Lincoln a telegram offering him the city as a Christmas gift, which is possibly the most Civil War thing ever. Here's a conquered city. Merry Christmas. Hope you like devastation. Lincoln spends part of that Christmas working on what will become the 13th Amendment, which will abolish slavery. He's also dealing with the constant stream of requests for pardons, clemency, special consideration. People writing to beg him to spare their sons from execution for desertion, to release prisoners of war, to show mercy in approximately 900 different circumstances. And Lincoln, who has a well-documented tendency toward clemency, spends hours reading these letters and making decisions. But he also makes time for letters that aren't official business, personal notes to people experiencing loss. Some of these letters were saved. Many were probably lost or destroyed. But the ones that survive show someone trying very hard to offer comfort, despite being himself probably in need of comfort. There's this detail that might help you drift off. Lincoln had a cat named Tabby that lived in the White House, and during the winter months, the cat would apparently sit near him while he worked. So picture this incredibly sad man writing letters to grieving families by lamplight, probably around Christmas when everyone else has gone to bed, with a cat nearby for company. It's such a small domestic detail in the middle of this enormous national tragedy. He writes about hope sometimes in these letters. Not cheap hope, not the kind that ignores reality, but the hope that comes from believing that pain has meaning, that sacrifice isn't entirely in vain, that the country might actually become something better when this is all over. He's trying to comfort others, sure, but you get the sense he's also trying to comfort himself, trying to find words that make the weight of all those deaths bearable. Christmas 1864 is Lincoln's last. He'll be assassinated in April of 1865, just days after the war officially ends. But that final Christmas, he's still writing letters, still trying to find the right words for people he'll never meet, whose losses he can't fix but can at least acknowledge. And maybe that's what makes these letters genuinely heartwarming in a complicated way. Not because they're cheerful, they're not, but because they represent someone in power choosing to see individual grief, to spend time on personal compassion, even when the national crisis is overwhelming, even when he has every excuse to be too busy, too important, too overwhelmed. So tonight, as you're falling asleep, think about that image. Lincoln at his desk, cold winter evening, cat nearby, trying one more time to write something true to someone experiencing the worst Christmas of their life. Knowing his words won't fix anything, writing them anyway, because sometimes, even in the darkest moments, someone cares enough to try. Ulysses S. Grant, Making Christmas a Federal Holiday, 1870. So here's something that might blow your mind a little bit as you're drifting off. Christmas wasn't always a federal holiday in the United States. I know. It feels like Christmas has been a thing since approximately the dawn of time. But no. For most of early American history, Christmas was just another day. Some states recognized it, some didn't. Some businesses closed, some stayed open. It was chaos, frankly, regional chaos. The Puritans in New England actually banned Christmas celebrations for a while because they thought it was too Catholic and too fun, which tells you everything you need to know about Puritan party planning. In Massachusetts, there was literally a law from 1659 that made celebrating Christmas illegal. You could be fined 5 shillings for showing Christmas spirit, which feels like the plot of a bad holiday movie, but was actual policy. That law stayed on the books until 1856. 1856. People were sending telegrams and getting daguerreotypes taken, and Massachusetts was still technically forbidding Christmas cheer. But by the 1860s, attitudes were shifting. Charles Dickens had published A Christmas Carol in 1843, and suddenly everyone was having feelings about Tiny Tim and thinking maybe Christmas should involve compassion and roasted geese instead of just quiet prayer. The Victorian celebration of Christmas, with trees and cards and elaborate dinners, was becoming fashionable among the upper classes, and various states were starting to recognize Christmas as an official holiday on their own. Alabama was first in 1836, then Louisiana and Arkansas. Slowly, state by state, Christmas was becoming official. But there was no federal recognition, which meant that if you worked for the federal government, Christmas was just another workday, unless your individual department decided otherwise. Federal courts stayed open, post offices operated. The government chugged along like it was any old Tuesday. Enter Ulysses S. Grant, who becomes president in 1869 after being the Union's most successful general during the Civil War. Grant is an interesting character for a bedtime story. He's quiet, often uncomfortable in social situations, definitely more at ease on a horse than at a dinner party. He's also dealing with the absolute mess of Reconstruction, trying to hold the country together after it literally tore itself apart, fighting against the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, attempting to protect the rights of formerly enslaved people against massive resistance from white Southerners. It's exhausting just to list it all. But in the middle of all this national chaos, on June 28th, 1870, Grant signs a law that makes Christmas a federal holiday. Just signs it. No big ceremony, no speech about the meaning of Christmas, no attempt to use it for political gain. He just does it. Along with New Year's Day, Independence Day, and Thanksgiving. Now, the law itself is pretty dry. It's called an act to establish certain national holidays, and it's basically administrative, saying that federal employees get these days off as paid holidays. That's it. Very bureaucratic. Very Grant, actually. The man was not known for flowery language or emotional displays. His approach to most things was identify the problem, find the most direct solution, implement it, move on. So when Congress sent him a bill that would give federal workers Christmas off, he signed it without fuss. But think about what this meant in 1870. The Civil War had ended just 5 years earlier. The country was still deeply divided. The South was under military occupation. There were violent conflicts over Reconstruction policies happening constantly. Former Confederates were waging terrorist campaigns against Black Americans and white Republicans. The economy was unstable. Political corruption was rampant. In fact, Grant's own administration would become infamous for scandals, though Grant himself was generally honest. In the middle of all this, making Christmas a federal holiday was a small gesture toward normalcy, toward peace, toward the idea that maybe, just maybe, the nation could share something, that there could be one day where everyone stopped fighting and working and arguing about everything and just rested, celebrated, whatever that meant to them individually. The interesting thing about Grant's relationship with Christmas is that he seems to have genuinely enjoyed it in a low-key way. There are accounts of Grant family Christmases being warm, child-focused affairs. Grant and his wife, Julia, had 4 children, and by 1870, they had young grandchildren starting to appear. The Grants would put up a Christmas tree in the White House, not the first to do so, but they continued the tradition. And there'd be gifts for the children, stockings hung, all the Victorian Christmas customs that were becoming standard. Grant himself wasn't particularly religious, despite being married in a Methodist ceremony. He was more of a practical, do the right thing type than a church every Sunday type. So his support for Christmas as a federal holiday probably had less to do with religious sentiment and more to do with understanding that people needed rest, needed celebration, needed something to mark the year besides tragedy and work. There's this detail from December of 1870, the first Christmas after the holiday became official, about Grant taking his children and grandchildren out in a sleigh when it snowed. Just riding around Washington in the snow, which had to be a rare moment of actual peace for a man who spent most of his presidency dealing with crises. The image is almost impossibly wholesome. The President of the United States, former commanding general of the Union Army, riding in a sleigh with small children, probably relieved to have one day where nobody expected him to solve the nation's problems. The federal holiday law didn't force anyone to celebrate Christmas or mandate how it should be celebrated. It just gave federal employees the day off. But the symbolic weight was significant. The federal government, the same government that had just fought a war to hold the country together, was now saying, this day matters. Take a break. Be with your families. Whatever Christmas means to you, you have permission to observe it. And here's something that makes this story particularly suitable for falling asleep. The law Grant signed is still in effect. The same basic statute with amendments over the years. Every federal holiday you get now traces back to that 1870 law or similar ones that followed. So, in a strange way, every time you have Christmas off from work, you're benefiting from a decision made by Ulysses S. Grant, while he was dealing with more stress than any reasonable person should have to handle. Grant served 2 terms as president, leaving office in 1877. His post-presidency was difficult. He lost all his money in a bad investment and had to write his memoirs while dying of throat cancer to provide for Julia. But for 8 years, he spent Christmas in the White House, presiding over a country that was slowly, painfully learning to have official holidays together. The law he signed wasn't dramatic, wasn't poetic, didn't solve any of the nation's real problems. But it created space for rest, for family, for whatever joy people could find in 1870 when the wounds of war were still so fresh. It acknowledged that humans need rhythm, work and rest, ordinary days and special ones. That even when everything is falling apart, maybe especially then, there should be days that are set aside as different. So tonight, when you're falling asleep thinking about presidential Christmases, remember Grant signing that law without fanfare in the middle of one of the most turbulent periods in American history. Remember that sometimes the most meaningful changes are quiet ones, administrative ones, the ones that just say, you deserve to rest. And speaking of finding joy in difficult times, let's talk about what happened when a president's grandchildren discovered that Christmas trees could be magical. Benjamin Harrison's grandchildren and the first White House Christmas tree. Okay, so we need to talk about Benjamin Harrison, who might be the most forgettable president in American history, except for one very specific thing. His grandchildren had the run of the White House, and Christmas 1889 was absolutely delightful because of it. Benjamin Harrison became president in 1889, defeating Grover Cleveland in one of those weird elections where Cleveland actually won the popular vote, but Harrison won the Electoral College. Harrison was the grandson of William Henry Harrison, who was president for exactly 31 days before dying of pneumonia, allegedly from giving a very long inaugural address in the rain without a coat, though historians debate that cause of death now. Anyway, Benjamin Harrison had a lot to prove, being the grandson of the president who most famously died immediately. Harrison himself was, by most accounts, not a particularly warm person in public. He was known as the human iceberg because of his stiff, formal manner with people he didn't know well. He'd shake hands like he was executing a legal contract, made no effort at small talk, just generally gave off strong, please don't touch me energy. Political allies described meeting him as an ordeal. He was brilliant, principled, and about as cuddly as a filing cabinet. But here's the thing. With his family, Harrison was apparently completely different. Warm, playful, affectionate. And in 1889, when he moved into the White House, he brought with him his daughter, Mary Harrison McKee, her husband, and their two small children, Benjamin Harrison McKee, who was about 3 years old and whom everyone called Baby McKee, and Mary Lodge McKee, who was born in the White House in 1891. Baby McKee became a national sensation. The press was obsessed with him. There are more photographs of Baby McKee than of President Harrison during this period, which tells you everything about America's priorities. The kid had a pet goat named His Whiskers, who pulled him around the White House grounds in a cart. And there's this famous incident where the goat ran away with Baby McKee in the cart, and President Harrison, the human iceberg himself, had to chase them down Pennsylvania Avenue in his top hat and coat, looking absolutely ridiculous because his grandson was being kidnapped by a goat. But let's talk about Christmas 1889, which is Harrison's first Christmas in the White House. This is the Christmas that featured what's generally recognized as the first official White House Christmas tree with electric lights. Now, there had been Christmas trees in the White House before. The Pierces had one, the Lincolns had small trees. Grant continued the tradition. But Harrison's 1889 tree was different because of the lights and because of how public it became. The tree was set up in the upstairs oval room, which was the family's living area. It was decorated with toys and candles, and here's where it gets interesting, experimental electric lights. Electricity in the White House was still new. It had been installed in 1891. Wait, no, let me check that. Actually, electricity was installed in 1891, so the 1889 tree would have had candles. Let me back up. Actually, the famous electrically lit tree was in 1891. The 1889 tree was still candles, but it was remarkable because Harrison opened it up to White House staff and their children. This wasn't common practice. The president's Christmas tree was usually a private family affair, but Harrison, possibly at the urging of his wife Caroline, decided to turn Christmas into a community event for the people who worked in the White House. Caroline Harrison, who deserves way more credit in this story, was actively involved in making the White House more livable and introducing more public celebrations. She was the one who organized the Christmas festivities, had the tree decorated, arranged for gifts for the staff's children. She was also dealing with tuberculosis during this time, which makes her energy in creating these celebrations even more remarkable. The 1889 Christmas had Baby McKee completely losing his mind with excitement, as 3-year-olds do. There are accounts of him running around the tree, climbing on furniture, probably getting into everything he wasn't supposed to. His grandfather, the formal president who struck fear into political operatives, apparently got down on the floor to play with him. The human iceberg melted in the presence of a toddler with a goat, which is honestly the most relatable thing about Benjamin Harrison. By Christmas of 1891, the White House had electricity, though Harrison and his wife were reportedly terrified of it. There are stories about them refusing to touch light switches because they were afraid of being electrocuted. The staff had to turn the lights on and off for them. So having electric lights on a Christmas tree was both exciting and probably mildly terrifying. The 1891 tree, now we're getting to the really famous one, was decorated with electric lights in multiple colors, which was absolutely cutting-edge technology. Thomas Edison's company had only started producing decorative electric lights a few years earlier. They were expensive, potentially dangerous, and extremely impressive. The lights didn't blink or flash like modern ones, they just glowed steadily in red, white, and blue. Baby McKee was 4 by this Christmas and had a new baby sister, Mary, who was born in April of 1891. The tree was again set up in the Oval Room, and again, staff families were invited to see it. There's something genuinely sweet about the most powerful man in the country being too scared to touch his own light switches, but making sure children could see an illuminated Christmas tree. Caroline Harrison, sadly, would die in October of 1892, just before the next Christmas. She'd been fighting tuberculosis for years, and it finally won. That Christmas, Harrison's third in the White House, was somber. There was a tree for the children because baby McKee and little Mary still needed Christmas, but it was a shadow of the previous celebrations. Harrison lost his re-election bid in 1892 to Grover Cleveland, the same Cleveland he'd beaten in 1888, making Cleveland the only president to serve non-consecutive terms. So Harrison's final Christmas in the White House was both grief-stricken and politically defeated. But he still made sure there was a tree for his grandchildren, still made sure they had stockings and presents and some semblance of holiday joy, even though he was mourning his wife and preparing to leave office. The image that stays with you from the Harrison Christmases, and this is the part that might help you sleep, is baby McKee under that electrically lit tree in 1891, probably reaching for ornaments he wasn't supposed to touch, with his baby sister nearby and his grandfather watching. For a moment, the presidency was just a man making sure his grandchildren had a magical Christmas. The tree glowing with those expensive, slightly dangerous electric lights. The whole family together, not knowing that Caroline would be gone within a year. There's something almost unbearably poignant about decorating a Christmas tree when you're dying, which Caroline Harrison was in 1891, even if she didn't fully know it yet. Putting lights on a tree for children who'll remember it long after you're gone. Making sure one more Christmas is special. But Harrison's grandchildren did remember. Baby McKee grew up to be Benjamin Harrison McKee, a businessman who lived until 1942. He would have carried memories of those White House Christmases his whole life, his grandfather, the president, playing with him, that remarkable tree with electric lights, his grandmother making everything warm before she disappeared. And that's what makes this story suitable for drifting off to sleep. The reminder that even the coldest, most formal people can melt for children. That even in the midst of political careers and tuberculosis and electric lights that might electrocute you, someone made sure there was a Christmas tree, made sure there were presents, made sure children got to experience wonder. The human iceberg chasing a goat down Pennsylvania Avenue for his grandson, a dying woman decorating a tree, a family making Christmas special in a house that belonged to the nation but, for 4 years, was also somehow home. But if you think electric lights on a tree were revolutionary, wait until you hear about the president who brought that technology directly to his own young daughters. Grover Cleveland installing electric Christmas lights for his daughters. All right, so we need to talk about Grover Cleveland, who has the distinction of being the only president to serve non-consecutive terms, which means he gets counted twice in the numbering system, 22nd and 24th, which is delightfully confusing for everyone, but more importantly for our purposes tonight. He was the president who specifically had electric Christmas lights installed for his young daughters during his second term, and the story is sweeter than you might expect from a man who was known for being gruff and vetoing everything. Let me set the scene. Cleveland's second term started in 1893. He's 55 years old and married to Frances Folsom Cleveland, who is 29 and was the youngest First Lady in history. Cleveland had married Frances in 1886 during his first term when she was 21, and he was 49, which raised eyebrows then and would raise even more eyebrows now. But this is not an episode about judging 19th century marriage practices. This is about Christmas lights, so let's stay focused. By 1893, the Clevelands have 2 young daughters. Ruth, born in 1891, and Esther, born in 1893, who has the distinction of being the only presidential child born in the White House itself. Later, they'd have three more children, but during the Christmases we're talking about, it's these two little girls who are the center of attention. Cleveland is not naturally a sentimental or particularly playful person. His nickname was Uncle Jumbo, which tells you something about his physique, but nothing about his warmth. He was known for being honest to the point of bluntness, working extraordinarily long hours, and having exactly zero patience for anything he considered frivolous. During his first term, he answered the White House phone himself because he didn't trust anyone else to do it properly. He'd veto bills constantly, over 400 vetoes in his first term, earning the nickname the Veto President. But something shifted when he became a father. Multiple accounts from people who knew Cleveland describe him as completely devoted to his daughters. He'd play with them for hours, which is remarkable for a man who otherwise seemed constitutionally incapable of relaxation. He'd carry them around the White House, make up games, let them interrupt important meetings. The same man who'd gruffly dismiss senators would get on the floor to play blocks with a toddler. So Christmas 1893 comes around. Cleveland's first Christmas back in the White House for his second term. Ruth is 2 years old, and Esther's a newborn, born in September. Frances Cleveland wants to make Christmas special, both for her daughters and to create some joy in what's been an incredibly difficult year. The Panic of 1893, one of the worst economic depressions in American history, is in full swing. Banks are failing. Unemployment is skyrocketing. Cleveland is dealing with constant political crises. The man looks exhausted in photos from this period. But Frances is determined. She arranges for a Christmas tree in the family quarters, and here's where the electric lights come in. She has electric lights specially installed on the tree for the children. Now remember, the White House has electricity by this point, but it's still new enough to be impressive and slightly scary. The lights would have been similar to the ones on the Harrison tree. Steady bulbs in different colors, probably red, white, and blue, because Americans are nothing if not patriotic about everything. The documented accounts from Christmas 1893 describe Cleveland being almost childlike himself in his excitement about showing the tree to Ruth. A 2-year-old doesn't fully understand Christmas yet, but she understands bright lights and her father's enthusiasm. There's this wonderful mental image of this large, grumpy man carefully carrying his toddler daughter to see the lit tree, probably worrying about the electrical fire risk the whole time, but committed to making it magical anyway. By Christmas 1894, there are more elaborate celebrations. Ruth is 3 now and actually understands what's happening. Esther is 1 and mostly interested in whatever can be put in her mouth. Frances has the White House decorated more extensively. Garlands, wreaths, a larger tree with more lights. The electric lights are becoming a tradition, something the Cleveland girls will grow up expecting. Here's a detail that's both charming and a little sad. Ruth Cleveland, the older daughter, becomes enormously famous as a child. The Baby Ruth candy bar is often said to be named after her, though the company denied this for trademark reasons. She's photographed constantly, featured in newspaper stories, essentially the Baby McKee of the Cleveland administration. But Ruth will die of diphtheria in 1904 when she's only 12 years old. So, these Christmas memories, her father showing her the electric lights, playing with her under the tree, are some of the brightest moments in a too short life. But in 1894, none of that tragedy has happened yet. It's just a family in the White House making Christmas special with relatively new technology. Cleveland, who works himself nearly to death, dealing with economic crisis and political opposition, takes time to make sure his daughters see a lit Christmas tree. Frances, who's managing an entire household staff and constant social obligations, Make sure there are stockings and presents and all the trappings of a Victorian Christmas. The 1895 Christmas is particularly well documented because by this point, Frances Cleveland has become a national celebrity in her own right. She's young, beautiful, fashionable, and there's intense public interest in how she decorates the White House for the holidays. Newspapers describe the Christmas tree with its electric lights in detail. What colors, how many bulbs, how they're arranged. It's early celebrity culture, essentially. People want to know what the president's Christmas looks like. By now, Ruth is 4 and Esther is 2, the perfect ages for Christmas magic. The girls have their own small tree in the nursery, in addition to the larger family tree. Both have electric lights, which is almost excessive, but also completely understandable if you're a parent who wants to give your children everything beautiful you can manage. Cleveland himself is deep into his second term at this point, dealing with foreign policy crises and labor disputes and the ongoing economic depression. But there are accounts of him reading Christmas stories to his daughters, helping them hang stockings, generally being a different person than the stern president everyone else encounters. It's the same dynamic you see with Harrison, these formal, difficult men transforming around children. The last Cleveland Christmas in the White House is 1896. Cleveland has already announced he won't seek a third term. Technically, it would be a second consecutive term, but a third term overall, which is confusing, and William McKinley will be elected in November. So December 1896 has that end of an era feeling. Ruth is 5, Esther is 3, and Frances is pregnant with their third daughter, Marion, who'll be born in 1898 after they've left the White House. The tree goes up as usual, electric lights glowing. Maybe Cleveland is a bit more aware this year that it's the last time. The next Christmas, they'll be in their private home in Princeton, New Jersey, and Christmas will be smaller, quieter, less observed by the nation. Maybe he takes a few extra moments watching his daughters with the lights, knowing this particular kind of magic, presidential Christmas with all its resources and attention, is ending. And here's the image to fall asleep on. Grover Cleveland, massive and gruff, sitting in the White House family quarters on a December evening in the 1890s. His young daughters playing near an electrically lit Christmas tree. The same man who vetoes everything and trusts no one, creating this moment of technological wonder for children who will remember it long after the political crises are forgotten. The lights glowing red and white and blue, steady and warm. The children laughing. The depression outside temporarily forgotten. Frances Cleveland will return to the White House years later. She'll marry again after Grover dies in 1908 and live until 1947. But those Christmases in the 1890s, with young daughters and electric lights that were still new enough to be miraculous, those are frozen in time. Perfect moments before the heartbreak of Ruth's death, before the century turns, when Christmas meant your father, who runs the country, stopped everything to watch you see lights. But if you think electricity made Christmas modern, wait until you hear about the president's children, who brought something decidedly old-fashioned back into the White House. Theodore Roosevelt's kids sneaking a forbidden tree into the White House. Okay, so this is one of the most charming presidential Christmas stories ever. And the fact that it involves children directly disobeying Theodore Roosevelt makes it even better. Because here's the thing about Teddy Roosevelt. The man was enthusiastic about approximately everything. Boxing, hunting, natural history, the strenuous life, speaking softly and carrying big sticks. But he had very specific opinions about conservation, and Christmas trees fell directly into that category. Roosevelt was America's first conservation president. He established national parks and forests, created wildlife refuges, and genuinely cared about protecting natural resources. And in the early 1900s, there was growing concern about the practice of cutting down evergreen trees just to bring them inside for a few weeks and then throw them away. To Roosevelt, this seemed wasteful and ecologically unsound. So he decided no Christmas trees in the White House, just ban them for environmental reasons. Now imagine being Roosevelt's children and hearing this decree. We're talking about a family that includes Kermit, Ethel, Archie, and Quentin Roosevelt, children who were famous for being absolutely wild. These kids kept a small zoo's worth of pets in the White House: ponies, a badger named Josiah, a blue macaw, snakes. They roller skated through the East Room. They smuggled ponies up the elevator to cheer up sick siblings. The White House staff probably had a support group. Christmas 1902 is when the Great Tree Rebellion happened. Roosevelt has been president for about a year. He became president in September 1901 after McKinley's assassination, and this is his family's second Christmas in the White House. The children are devastated by the no tree policy. They've grown up with Christmas trees. They want a Christmas tree. The fact that their father has very principled environmental reasons for the ban is, from a child's perspective, entirely beside the point. So Archie Roosevelt, who's 8 years old, and Quentin, who's about 5, decide to take matters into their own hands. Well, mostly Archie. Quentin probably just follows along because that's what little brothers do. The boys somehow acquire a small evergreen tree. Accounts vary on exactly how. Some say they got it from the grounds, some say they brought it in from elsewhere. But they get this tree and they sneak it up to a closet in the upstairs sewing room. Then they decorate it with whatever they can find. This is not an elegant Victorian Christmas tree with carefully placed ornaments and ribbon. This is children cobbling together decorations from around the house. Paper chains, maybe, small toys, whatever seemed festive to two boys who were determined to have Christmas their way. Christmas morning comes, and they reveal the tree to the family. And here's where Theodore Roosevelt has to decide what kind of father he wants to be. On one hand, his children have directly violated his environmental policy. On the other hand, they're children who wanted a Christmas tree so badly, they staged a covert operation involving guerrilla decorating. The story goes that Roosevelt was initially stern about the disobedience, but quickly softened. Because how do you stay angry at children who orchestrated a Christmas tree heist out of pure holiday spirit? There's also the detail that Edith Roosevelt, Theodore's wife, probably wasn't entirely surprised by this rebellion. She was the manager of the Roosevelt chaos, the one who kept 6 children and countless animals from burning down the White House. She likely recognized that the no tree policy was never going to work with this particular family. But here's where the story gets even better. Instead of just accepting the tree and moving on, Roosevelt decided to educate his children properly. He arranged for Gifford Pinchot, who was the head of the U.S. Forest Service and one of America's leading conservationists, to come talk to the boys about forestry and conservation. Pinchot explained that if trees were farmed specifically for Christmas, grown and harvested in a managed, sustainable way, then cutting them down wasn't actually harmful to forests. In fact, Christmas tree farming could be good for the environment if done correctly. This completely changed Roosevelt's mind. If Christmas trees could be part of sustainable forestry, rather than destructive harvesting from wild forests, then he was fine with them. Problem solved through education and conversation. The Roosevelt family would have Christmas trees going forward, and Theodore would feel environmentally sound about it. The image that makes this story perfect for bedtime is Archie and Quentin in that closet, earnestly decorating their contraband tree, probably giggling about how they're getting away with something. And then Christmas morning, that moment of reveal when they show their father what they've done, nervous and excited at the same time. And Roosevelt, who could be bombastic and overwhelming, looking at his children's determination and ultimately choosing to learn something new rather than just enforce the rule. Christmas 1903 and beyond would feature proper Roosevelt family trees, fully sanctioned by presidential decree. The children would help decorate, and knowing the Roosevelt kids, they probably made it an enthusiastic, chaotic event. There'd be ornaments at weird angles and decorations that made sense only to children, and probably at least one small animal investigating the tree who shouldn't be there. The Roosevelt White House Christmases were loud, crowded affairs. 6 children, various relatives, the ever present menagerie of pets, Theodore reading Christmas stories in his distinctive voice. Too loud, too enthusiastic, but completely genuine. Edith managing everything with the calm of someone who's given up on controlling chaos and now just surfs along with it. And in later years, probably someone telling the story of the time Archie and Quentin smuggled in a tree. There's something deeply comforting about this story, not just because it's children being resourceful and parents being flexible, but because it shows that even absolute convictions, like Roosevelt's environmental principles, can evolve when you're willing to learn. That being a good parent sometimes means letting your children teach you something, that family traditions matter enough to fight for, even if you're 8 years old and your opponent is the President of the United States. So tonight, as you drift off, think about those two boys hiding a Christmas tree in a White House closet, decorating it in secret, believing with complete certainty that Christmas required a tree and they were going to make it happen. Think about their father, who could have punished them, but instead got curious about whether his reasoning was actually sound. Think about Gifford Pinchot, patiently explaining forestry management to children who just wanted Christmas to feel right. And think about all the Christmases after, when the Roosevelt tree went up legitimately, and maybe Archie and Quentin felt just a little bit proud that they'd been the ones to change presidential policy through sheer determination and one secretly decorated evergreen. But while Roosevelt's children were bringing trees into the White House, another president would take the Christmas tree tradition national in a way no one had before. Calvin Coolidge lighting the first national Christmas tree. Let me tell you about Calvin Coolidge, who might be the most unexpectedly perfect person to light the first national Christmas tree, specifically because he was known for saying almost nothing, ever, and yet this one gesture became one of the most enduring Christmas traditions in American history. Coolidge became president in August 1923 when Warren G. Harding died suddenly. Coolidge was vice president at the time, visiting his family in Vermont, and his father, who was a notary public, administered the oath of office by kerosene lamp at 2:47 in the morning in their family home, which is possibly the most Calvin Coolidge way to become president, quietly in rural Vermont with minimal ceremony. By December 1923, Coolidge has been president for about 4 months and is settling into the role. He's known as Silent Cal because of his legendary terseness. There are endless stories about his refusal to engage in small talk. Once, a woman at a dinner party told him she'd bet she could get more than 2 words out of him, and he replied, "You lose." That was it. That was the whole conversation. But here's what's interesting. Coolidge was dealing with a nation that desperately needed something unifying and hopeful. The country was emerging from World War I, navigating prohibition, experiencing the prosperity and cultural changes of the 1920s. There was optimism, sure, but also anxiety about how fast everything was changing. People needed something that felt permanent and shared. Enter the idea for a national Christmas tree. The concept came from the Society for Electrical Development and local civic groups in Washington, D.C., who wanted to create a national Christmas celebration that everyone could participate in, even if only symbolically. They proposed putting up a large tree on the Ellipse, the park just south of the White House, and having the president light it in a public ceremony. December 24th, 1923. Christmas Eve. The tree is a balsam fir from Vermont, Coolidge's home state, which is a nice touch. It's decorated with 2,500 electric lights, which is an enormous number for 1923. Remember, many rural areas still don't have electricity at all. These lights represent modernity, progress, hope. At 8 o'clock in the evening, people start gathering around the tree. There are thousands of them. Estimates range from 3 to 5,000 people. They're standing in the cold December air waiting to see what this national Christmas tree thing is going to be. The University of Vermont Glee Club is there to sing carols. The Marine Band performs. There's an almost carnival atmosphere, except quieter, more reverent. And then Calvin Coolidge appears. Silent Cal himself, probably wishing he could be literally anywhere else because public displays are not his thing. But he's the president, so he does it. He walks to the tree, and at precisely 8 o'clock, he presses a button that lights up all 2,500 bulbs at once. The crowd gasps. Because even though electric lights aren't new by 1923, seeing this many of them suddenly illuminate a massive tree in the darkness is still magical. The lights reflect off the White House behind them. The tree glows against the winter sky. And for a moment, everyone gathered there shares something beautiful. Coolidge gives a short speech. Very short, because it's Coolidge. He says that Christmas is about peace and goodwill, about remembering what binds Americans together rather than what divides them, about how this tree represents hope for the future. He manages to be both dignified and warm, which is a neat trick for someone who usually sounds like he's reading a tax code. But here's what makes this tradition particularly meaningful. Coolidge didn't just light the tree in 1923 and call it done. He established it as an annual event. Every year after, there'd be a national Christmas tree lighting. It became something Americans could count on, could gather for, could watch, and feel part of something larger than themselves. The 1924 lighting happens again, and this time it's slightly more elaborate. More people attend, more organization. The tradition is taking root, no pun intended. Coolidge lights the tree again, says a few words again, and goes back inside again, probably relieved that his public obligation is fulfilled for another year. By 1925, it's an established thing. Radio broadcasts carry the ceremony to Americans across the country. People who can't be in Washington can listen to the tree lighting in their homes. It's becoming a national moment, the official start of Christmas for the whole country, not just the people who could physically attend. Think about what this meant in the 1920s. Radio is still relatively new. The idea that everyone across the country could experience the same moment simultaneously is revolutionary. Farm families in Kansas, factory workers in Detroit, society people in New York, all of them listening to the president light the national Christmas tree, all of them hearing the same carols, the same message of peace and unity. Coolidge serves until March 1929, which means he lights the national Christmas tree 6 times total. Each year it becomes more popular. Each year the ceremony gets a bit more refined. But the core remains the same: the president, the tree, the lights, the moment of shared celebration. And here's the beautiful part. The tradition continues after Coolidge leaves office. Every president since has lit the national Christmas tree. Through the Depression, through World War II, through every crisis and celebration since 1923, the tree has moved locations a few times. The ceremonies have evolved, but that basic gesture, the president lighting a tree for the nation, remains. Silent Cal, who hated public speaking and avoided crowds whenever possible, created one of America's most enduring public traditions. The man who was famous for saying nothing gave the country a way to say something together every December. There's an irony there that's almost too perfect. So tonight, as you're falling asleep, imagine that first lighting in 1923. The cold December air. Thousands of people gathered in darkness. The moment when Coolidge presses the button and 2,500 lights blaze to life simultaneously. The collective gasp. The way everyone's face would have been illuminated in that instant, all looking at the same beautiful thing. And imagine all the Christmas Eve since. Every president standing in front of a tree, pressing a button, continuing what Calvin Coolidge started, because he understood that sometimes the quietest person can create the loudest tradition. But if one tree could unite a nation during the prosperity of the 20s, imagine what Christmas could mean during the hardest years America would face. FDR's family oriented Christmases during the Depression and World War II. So, we need to talk about Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who spent 12 consecutive Christmases as president, more than any other person, and how those Christmases spanned from the depths of the Great Depression through most of World War II, which means FDR had to figure out how to celebrate Christmas while the nation was, at various points, starving or fighting for survival or both. Roosevelt becomes president in March 1933. The country is in the absolute worst of the Depression. Banks have failed. Unemployment is at 25%. People are literally starving. There are bread lines in every major city. Farmers are losing their land. The previous Christmas, in December 1932, had been bleak beyond description. Hooverville's full of desperate people, children going hungry, complete economic collapse. So Christmas 1933, FDR's first as president, has to somehow acknowledge the suffering while also offering hope. This is a nearly impossible balance. How do you celebrate when so many people have nothing? How do you talk about joy when families are homeless? FDR's approach is to make Christmas visibly family-centered and to emphasize simple traditions over material extravagance. The Roosevelt family, FDR, Eleanor, their children and grandchildren, celebrate Christmas at the White House with all the traditional elements, but in a way that's meant to be relatable. There's a tree, yes, but it's decorated with handmade ornaments and paper chains, things that anyone could replicate. There are stockings hung by the fireplace. Christmas dinner is turkey and traditional foods, not elaborate foreign delicacies. Eleanor Roosevelt, who is absolutely crucial to understanding these Depression-era Christmases, writes her daily newspaper column, My Day, describing their celebrations in detail. She talks about wrapping presents, decorating the tree, preparing dinner. She makes it sound cozy and achievable, not luxurious. She emphasizes that Christmas is about family and tradition, not about how much money you spend. The 1934 Christmas has FDR delivering a Christmas Eve radio address that's broadcast nationally. Millions of Americans listen to their president talking about Christmas from the White House. He emphasizes hope, recovery, the progress being made through New Deal programs. But he also acknowledges that many people are still struggling, that Christmas this year might be difficult, that it's okay to have simple celebrations. By 1935, things are slightly better economically. Not good, not even okay, but slightly less catastrophic. The Roosevelt Christmas that year includes the grandchildren running around the White House, which becomes a recurring image in Eleanor's writing. The president's grandchildren bringing chaos and joy to the formal spaces of American power. FDR himself is dealing with paralysis from polio, though the public doesn't fully understand the extent of his disability. He uses a wheelchair but goes to great lengths to hide it. But at Christmas, with family, he's more relaxed. There are photos of him surrounded by grandchildren, helping them open presents, clearly enjoying the noise and disorder. Then comes December 1941. Pearl Harbor happens on December 7th. America enters World War II. Christmas is 2.5 weeks after the attack, and the nation is in complete shock and mobilizing for war. This Christmas has to be different. It has to acknowledge that everything has changed. FDR invites Winston Churchill to spend Christmas at the White House. Churchill arrives on December 22nd and stays through the holidays. On Christmas Eve, FDR and Churchill appear together on the White House balcony to light the national Christmas tree. 40,000 people gather to watch, and it's broadcast to millions more on radio. The symbolism is powerful. Britain and America together, celebrating Christmas while at war. FDR speaks about fighting for freedom. Churchill gives a speech about how he's spending Christmas far from home but feels at home with allies. The tree lighting becomes not just a national tradition but an international statement. Inside the White House that Christmas, there are Roosevelt grandchildren and Churchill's staff, and an atmosphere of determined cheerfulness despite everything. Eleanor organizes Christmas dinner for dozens of people. There are presents under the tree. Traditional carols are sung. Life continues deliberately, defiantly, even as the country mobilizes for war. Christmas 1942, 1943, 1944. These are war Christmases. Sons and husbands are overseas. Rationing means food is limited. Gold stars in windows mark homes where someone died in service. But the Roosevelt White House continues the traditions. The tree goes up, presents are exchanged. FDR delivers his Christmas messages, emphasizing hope and eventual victory. The 1944 Christmas is FDR's last. He'll die in April 1945, just before the war ends in Europe. But that final Christmas, he's surrounded by family, grandchildren, the people he loves. The tree is lit, stockings are hung. Despite everything, despite the war, despite his failing health, despite 12 years of crisis after crisis, Christmas still happens. And that's ultimately what makes FDR's Christmases meaningful. The persistence. The commitment to celebrating family and tradition even when the world is falling apart. The message that life continues, that joy matters, that gathering together around a tree with the people you love is worth doing even in the darkest times. So as you drift off tonight, think about those 12 Roosevelt Christmases. Think about the evolution from depression to war. Think about grandchildren opening presents while their president grandfather watches. Think about Eleanor describing simple decorations for millions of struggling readers. Think about FDR and Churchill on that balcony in December 1941, lighting a tree while preparing for the greatest conflict in human history. And think about the quiet determination to make Christmas happen anyway, to keep traditions alive, to tell a suffering nation that hope and family and simple celebrations still matter. Because sometimes the most important thing a leader can do is show up for Christmas. Eisenhower's hand-painted Christmas cards. All right, so here's something that might genuinely surprise you as you're drifting off. Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in World War II. The man who planned D-Day, 5-star general, President of the United States. This guy painted. Like actually painted. With brushes and canvases and everything. And not just as some symbolic presidential hobby photo opportunity. He really painted for relaxation, for joy, and every Christmas during his presidency, he'd create hand-painted Christmas cards to send to close friends and family. Eisenhower didn't start painting until he was in his 50s. The story goes that in 1943, while he was Supreme Commander dealing with the unimaginable stress of directing the Allied war effort, his friend Thomas Stevens suggested he take up painting as a way to relax. Eisenhower was skeptical at first. He was a military man, not an artist, but he tried it and something clicked. He found that when he was painting, his mind could rest in a way it couldn't otherwise. By the time Eisenhower becomes president in January 1953, painting has become a serious hobby. He has a studio set up at the White House and later at his farm in Gettysburg. He paints landscapes mostly, pastoral scenes, mountains, rivers, things that are peaceful and far away from military strategy and political crisis. His style is earnest and straightforward, which is very Eisenhower. No abstract expressionism, no experimental techniques, just honest attempts to capture what he sees. Now, the Christmas card tradition starts early in his presidency. For Christmas 1953, his first as president, Eisenhower decides to paint an original image for the family's Christmas card, not to have an artist paint something on his behalf, but to do it himself. The painting he chooses is a winter landscape, bare trees, snow, a quiet scene that evokes peace and simplicity. Think about what this means from a presidential workload perspective. Eisenhower is running the country during the Cold War. There's the Korean War ending, McCarthyism happening, the beginning of the civil rights movement, nuclear weapons proliferation, the entire terrifying standoff with the Soviet Union. The man has slightly more important things to do than paint Christmas cards, but he does it anyway, because it matters to him that these cards be personal, be from him, be real. The 1954 Christmas card features another Eisenhower original, this time a painting of a farmhouse. The image is reproduced and printed for the official White House Christmas cards that go out to thousands of people. But Eisenhower also hand paints individual versions for close friends. These aren't prints. These are actual small paintings, each one taking hours of work, each one unique. Mamie Eisenhower, his wife, is apparently very supportive of this hobby, though she sometimes has to remind him that he has presidential duties to attend to and can't spend all day in his painting studio. There are accounts of Eisenhower getting so absorbed in painting that he loses track of time, which is kind of adorable for someone whose previous job required managing millions of soldiers across continents. By Christmas 1955, the tradition is well established. Eisenhower paints another winter scene. He seems particularly drawn to winter landscapes, which makes sense. They're peaceful, muted, gentle. The opposite of war and politics. That year's card goes out with Eisenhower's painting reproduced on the front, and close friends and family receive hand-painted versions. Here's a detail that makes this particularly charming. Eisenhower wasn't precious about his art. He didn't think of himself as a great painter. He painted because he enjoyed it, because it calmed him, because creating something beautiful with his hands was the opposite of everything else he'd done in his career. When people complimented his paintings too effusively, he'd brush it off, almost embarrassed. He knew he wasn't a professional artist. He was just a guy who liked to paint. The 1956 through 1958 Christmas cards all feature Eisenhower originals. Some are winter scenes, some are autumn landscapes. One is a particularly nice mountain vista. Each one shows incremental improvement in technique. His use of light gets better, his composition more confident. He's learning, practicing, getting more skilled with each painting. There's something deeply humanizing about imagining the president sitting in his studio, probably wearing old clothes splattered with paint, concentrating on getting the shadow of a tree just right. The same hands that signed the world-changing documents, that directed armies, that held nuclear launch codes, those hands also mixed colors on a palette and carefully applied them to canvas to create something peaceful for Christmas. During his presidency, Eisenhower painted over 250 works total. Not all Christmas themed, obviously, but a significant portion created with the holiday season in mind. He'd paint scenes that evoked warmth, home, peace, all the things he believed Christmas should represent. And he'd reproduce these images for the White House Christmas cards, sharing his vision of a peaceful world with everyone who received them. The 1959 Christmas card, his next to last as president, features a particularly beautiful snow scene. By this point, Eisenhower has been painting for 16 years, and his skill shows. The painting has depth, atmosphere, a genuine sense of quiet beauty. It's the work of someone who's put in hours and hours of practice, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. His final Christmas in the White House is 1960. John F. Kennedy has been elected to succeed him, and Eisenhower is preparing to leave office in January. That final Christmas card features one more Eisenhower original, a winter landscape that feels almost nostalgic. Like he's already looking back on his time in office with mixed feelings. After leaving the presidency, Eisenhower continues painting. He spends more time at his Gettysburg farm, where he has a dedicated studio, and painting becomes even more central to his retirement. He paints through the 1960s until his health declines. Some of his best work comes after the presidency, when he has more time, less stress, more opportunity to just be an old man with a paintbrush. The hand painted Christmas cards that Eisenhower gave to close friends are collector's items now. Not because they're particularly valuable as art, though they're genuinely lovely, but because they represent something rare: authentic personal creation by a president. Not something crafted by a team of advisors and graphic designers, but actual paint applied by the president's own hand. And that's what makes this story perfect for falling asleep. The image of Eisenhower in his studio, probably late in the evening after a long day of Cold War crisis management, painting a peaceful winter scene for Christmas, mixing white and blue for snow, adding bare tree branches with careful strokes, creating something beautiful and calm and entirely his own. The man who'd seen the absolute worst of human capability, war on an unimaginable scale, choosing to spend his free time creating images of peace, choosing to make his Christmas cards personal and handmade, choosing to give people something he'd actually made himself, even though he could have delegated it to anyone. There's something almost meditative about that choice, something that says, despite everything, despite knowing what humans are capable of in war, beauty still matters. Personal gestures still matter. Taking time to paint a winter scene for friends still matters. So tonight, drift off thinking about Eisenhower with paint on his fingers, squinting at a canvas, trying to get the light on snow exactly right. Think about those hand-painted cards arriving in mailboxes across the country, friends opening them and realizing the president had actually painted this himself. Think about finding peace through creating something beautiful, even when, especially when, the world feels chaotic. But if one president found peace in painting, another would find it in creating an entire magical experience for his children. JFK and Jackie's Nutcracker Christmas for their children. Let's talk about Christmas 1961 in the Kennedy White House, because this is where Jacqueline Kennedy decided to create what might be the most elaborately beautiful Christmas celebration any presidential children had experienced up to that point, centered entirely around the Nutcracker Ballet. John F. Kennedy becomes president in January 1961 at age 43, the youngest elected president in history. Jackie is 31. They have two small children, Caroline, who's 3 years old, and John Jr., who's not quite a year old yet. They also have the entire nation watching their every move because the Kennedys represent youth and glamour and a new era, and everyone is obsessed with them. Jackie Kennedy is particularly conscious of raising her children in the White House without letting them become public spectacles. She wants Caroline and John to have as normal a childhood as possible, which is obviously impossible when you live in a mansion with armed guards and tourists taking pictures of the outside. But she tries, fiercely. She sets up a private preschool in the White House for Caroline and a few other children. She limits press access, she creates private family spaces, and when Christmas 1961 approaches, she decides it's going to be magical. Not just nice, not just traditional. Actually magical. She's been redecorating the White House since moving in, bringing in antiques, commissioning restoration work, essentially transforming it from slightly dowdy government building to genuine showplace. And she applies that same aesthetic vision to Christmas. The centerpiece of the 1961 Christmas celebration is a Nutcracker theme. Jackie loves ballet, and the Nutcracker is perfect for Christmas with small children. It's fantastical, it has a child protagonist, it's visually stunning. So she decides the White House Christmas will essentially be a Nutcracker experience. She has the tree in the Blue Room decorated entirely in Nutcracker-themed ornaments, toy soldiers, sugar plum fairies, mice, all the characters from the ballet rendered as ornaments. The tree itself is enormous, probably 18 feet tall, and it's decorated floor to ceiling with these handmade ornaments that must have taken weeks to create. Nothing generic, nothing store bought, everything custom made for this specific vision. But Jackie doesn't stop with the tree. She arranges for dancers from the New York City Ballet to perform excerpts from the Nutcracker for the children. Not a full performance. Caroline is 3, her attention span is limited, but key scenes: the Sugar Plum Fairy, the Waltz of the Snowflakes, the dancers perform in costume in the White House, and Caroline and her little friends from the preschool watch, completely mesmerized. Think about what this means from Caroline's perspective. She's 3 years old. She lives in this massive house with Secret Service agents and staff everywhere. Her father is president, which she probably doesn't fully understand. And then Christmas comes, and suddenly there are ballet dancers in costumes twirling through the rooms, and the tree is decorated with toy soldiers that match the dancers, and everything is magical and coordinated and beautiful. JFK himself is mostly a bemused observer in all this. He's dealing with the Berlin crisis, the Bay of Pigs fallout, escalating tensions with the Soviet Union, the beginning of American involvement in Vietnam. The man has the entire Cold War to manage. But he shows up for the Christmas celebrations, watches the ballet with Caroline on his lap, probably thinking about nuclear weapons the whole time, but making an effort to be present. There's a famous photograph from this Christmas, JFK sitting with Caroline, both of them watching something off camera, probably the ballet dancers. Caroline is in a fancy dress, JFK in a suit, and they both look genuinely engaged. It's a rare moment of captured normalcy in what was otherwise a very abnormal life. John Jr. is too young to really participate. He's not even one yet at this Christmas. But he's there in his mother's arms, probably sleeping through most of it, blissfully unaware that he's experiencing what will become one of the most famous childhood Christmases in presidential history. Jackie writes about this Christmas in letters to friends, describing how thrilled Caroline was with the ballet, how perfect the tree looked, how she wanted to create something beautiful and memorable for her children. There's a poignancy to her determination to make childhood magical for Caroline and John, knowing that they're growing up in such an unusual, scrutinized environment. The 1962 Christmas continues the tradition of themed, elaborate celebrations. This year isn't Nutcracker focused, but it's still carefully designed, still beautiful, still centered on creating magic for the children. Jackie has established that White House Christmases under her management will be experiences, not just holidays. By Christmas 1963, everything has changed. JFK is assassinated on November 22nd. Jackie is a widow at 34. Caroline is 5, John Jr. is 2, and their father is dead. That Christmas is spent not in the White House, but in Georgetown, in a private home, with the family in deep mourning. But those earlier Christmases, 1961 and 1962, when JFK was alive and Caroline was tiny and John Jr. was a baby, those remain frozen in photographs and memories as examples of what Jackie thought childhood Christmas should be. Beautiful, artistic, magical, carefully crafted to create wonder. The Nutcracker Christmas of 1961 particularly stands out because of its specificity. Jackie didn't just want a pretty Christmas. She wanted a themed, coherent, artistically meaningful Christmas that would be memorable for Caroline. She wanted her daughter to see ballet dancers and understand that beauty and art were important. She wanted Christmas to be an aesthetic experience, not just a commercial one. And from all accounts, it worked. Caroline remembered those Christmases her entire life. The ballet dancers, the special tree, the feeling of being in the center of something magical that her mother had created specifically for her. There's something both wonderful and heartbreaking about Jackie's determination to create perfect Christmases for her children. Wonderful because she succeeded. She really did make it magical. Heartbreaking because she knew, or maybe sensed, how precious and fleeting that time was. Because less than 3 years after that first Nutcracker Christmas, her husband would be dead and her children would grow up without a father. But in December 1961, none of that has happened yet. It's just a young family in the White House, a mother creating magic for her children, a father taking time from managing the Cold War to watch ballet with his daughter. It's toy soldiers on a tree and dancers in costume, and a 3-year-old girl watching the Sugar Plum Fairy with absolute wonder. So tonight, as you drift off, imagine that White House Blue Room in December 1961. The enormous tree covered in nutcracker ornaments catching the light. Ballet dancers moving gracefully through the space, their costumes swirling. Caroline watching, transfixed. Jackie orchestrating it all with the same attention to detail she brought to everything. JFK present despite the weight of the world on his shoulders. Imagine the effort it took to create that moment. The planning, the coordination, the vision, all for a 3-year-old's Christmas. All because a mother believed her children deserved magic, even in the White House, even during the Cold War, even when everything else was complicated and difficult. Because sometimes the most important thing you can do is create beauty for the people you love, even if, especially if, the world outside is cold and frightening and uncertain. And speaking of creating magic through personal connection, let's talk about a president who wrote letters to children who believed in something special. Reagan's Christmas letters to children. So here's the thing about Ronald Reagan. Whatever your politics, whatever you think about his presidency, the man wrote letters to children who wrote to him about Santa Claus. And he did it with such genuine warmth and care that it's actually impossible to be cynical about it at 2 a.m. when you're trying to fall asleep. Reagan becomes president in January 1981 at age 69, the oldest person elected president up to that point. He's a former actor, former governor of California, and he brings to the presidency a very specific set of skills. He's comfortable on camera, he's good with scripted material, and he understands the power of personal connection. He's also a compulsive letter writer, which becomes important for our story. Throughout his presidency, Reagan receives thousands of letters from children. Kids write to the president about everything: their pet hamsters, their problems at school, why the sky is blue, whether Reagan has met Santa Claus. Most presidents have staff who handle this kind of correspondence with form letters, but Reagan actually reads many of these letters himself, and for the ones about Christmas and Santa, he writes personal responses. Not all of them, obviously. The man is running the country and dealing with the Cold War and the economy and approximately 900 different crises. But he makes time for some, especially the ones from younger children who are asking sincere questions about Christmas magic. There's one letter from 1981, Reagan's first Christmas as president, where a young girl writes asking if the president has met Santa Claus and if Santa comes to the White House. Reagan writes back, in his own handwriting, not typed by a secretary, telling her that yes, Santa comes to the White House, and yes, he's met him, and that Santa told him the girl had been very good that year. The letter is sweet without being condescending. It treats the child's question seriously. It doesn't wink at the parents or break character. Reagan commits fully to the bit, which makes sense for a former actor. He understands that if you're going to maintain magic for a child, you have to commit completely. Another letter from 1983 is to a boy who's worried that because his family is moving to a new house right before Christmas, Santa won't know where to find him. Reagan writes back assuring him that Santa has a very sophisticated tracking system, basically the North Pole version of air traffic control, and that moving to a new house won't be a problem at all. He tells the boy that Santa has been handling address changes for centuries and is very good at it. What's interesting about these letters is that Reagan doesn't outsource the empathy to his staff. He could have. He could have had speechwriters craft perfect responses, but the letters are in his handwriting, in his voice, with his specific way of explaining things. They're genuinely from him. There's a letter from December 1984 where a girl writes asking how Santa gets to all the houses in one night. Reagan's response is delightful. He explains that Santa operates in a different time zone than regular people, kind of like how when you fly on an airplane, time seems different, and that's how he manages to visit everyone. It's creative, it's kind of logical in a magical way, and it shows Reagan actually thinking about how to answer the question thoughtfully. Reagan's own childhood Christmases had been modest. He grew up in small town Illinois in the 1910s and 20s, and his family didn't have much money. His father struggled with alcoholism. Christmases were probably simple, maybe sometimes stressful. But Reagan remembered the importance of believing in magic when you're young, of having that sense of wonder before the world gets complicated. By Christmas 1985, word has gotten around among children that if you write to President Reagan about Santa, you might get a personal response. The number of letters increases. Reagan can't possibly answer all of them, but he still answers some. His staff helps with the bulk, but Reagan continues to personally respond to select letters that particularly touch him. There's one from December 1986 that's particularly sweet. A boy writes explaining that his older brother told him Santa isn't real, and he's devastated and wants the president to confirm the truth. Reagan writes back with a masterclass in diplomacy. He doesn't directly lie, but he talks about the spirit of Santa, about how giving and kindness are real even if the literal North Pole situation is complicated. He tells the boy that believing in good things is never wrong, and that Christmas magic is about more than just one person in a red suit. It's the kind of letter that lets the child continue believing while also planting seeds for an eventual gentle understanding. It's respectful of where the kid is developmentally. It's kind. Reagan and Nancy also continue the tradition of reading The Night Before Christmas at various White House Christmas events throughout his presidency. There are photos of Reagan in his suit, reading the poem to groups of children, doing different voices for the characters. He's fully committed to the performance, which makes sense for someone who spent decades acting. The thing about Reagan's Christmas letter writing is that it reveals something softer than his public persona. On television and in speeches, he's the great communicator, polished and presidential. But in these handwritten letters to children, he's more like a grandfather, warm and a bit silly, willing to play along with magic for the sake of someone small who needs it. By his final Christmas in office, December 1988, Reagan has written dozens, maybe hundreds, of personal letters to children about Santa and Christmas over 8 years. Some are in the Reagan Library now, preserved as historical documents, which is kind of hilarious. Future historians studying Reagan's foreign policy can also see his letter explaining to a 7-year-old how reindeer fly. After leaving office, Reagan continues writing Christmas letters when he can, though his Alzheimer's diagnosis in 1994 eventually makes this impossible. But for years into his retirement, if a letter from a child about Santa happened to reach him, he'd respond. The letters aren't profound. They're not going to change anyone's understanding of the Reagan presidency, but they're real and they're kind, and they represent a president taking time from nuclear negotiations and economic summits to tell a child that, yes, Santa knows where you live, and yes, you're on the good list, and yes, magic is real if you believe in it. So tonight, as you drift off, think about Reagan at his desk, probably late evening after the official work is done, reading a letter from a child who's worried Santa won't come because they've been bad, or won't find their new house, or might not have enough presents for everyone. Think about him picking up his pen and writing a response in his own handwriting, assuring them that everything will be okay, that Santa is real, that Christmas magic exists. Think about the deliberate choice to maintain wonder for children, to protect that brief window where everything is magical and possible, to tell small lies in service of big truths about kindness and hope and belief. Because sometimes being president means managing crises and making impossible decisions, but sometimes it means writing a letter to a 7-year-old about reindeer. And speaking of maintaining joy during serious times, let's talk about a president, a dog, and Christmas stockings. George H.W. Bush's Christmas with Millie the dog. All right, so we need to talk about George H.W. Bush and his English Springer Spaniel, Millie, because this is one of the most purely delightful presidential pet stories ever, and it involves Christmas stockings for dogs, which is exactly the kind of wholesome content you need at whatever hour you're listening to this. George Bush becomes president in January 1989 after serving 8 years as Reagan's vice president. He's 64 years old, has been in public service basically his entire adult life, and brings to the White House his wife Barbara, their children and grandchildren who visit constantly, and Millie the dog. Millie is an English Springer Spaniel, and she's not just a pet, she's a genuine member of the Bush family. Barbara Bush absolutely adores this dog. There are countless photos of Barbara walking Millie on the White House grounds, Millie sitting in meetings, Millie being generally present for everything. The dog has better access to the Oval Office than most cabinet members. In 1990, Barbara Bush actually publishes a book called Millie's Book as Dictated to Barbara Bush, which is written from Millie's perspective and describes life in the White House from a dog's point of view. The book becomes a bestseller and earns more money in 1990 than George Bush's presidential salary, which Barbara finds absolutely hilarious and mentions in every interview. But let's talk specifically about Christmas, because the Bush family Christmas traditions with Millie are wonderfully absurd in the best way. Starting with Christmas 1989, their first in the White House, the Bushes hang a Christmas stocking for Millie. Not as a joke, not as a photo op, but as an actual stocking that actually gets filled with actual dog treats and toys. Think about this for a second. The President of the United States and the First Lady are filling a Christmas stocking for their dog. There are serious things happening in the world. The Cold War is ending. The Berlin Wall just fell in November. The Soviet Union is collapsing. Germany is reunifying. And George Bush is making sure Millie has a stocking with her name on it, hanging next to the human family stockings. Christmas morning 1989, Millie opens her stocking. Well, Barbara opens it for her, but Millie gets the treats and toys inside. The Bush grandchildren are there. They have something like 12 grandchildren by this point, and everyone watches Millie investigate her Christmas loot with the same enthusiasm you'd give a human toddler opening presents. The family takes photos of this. The dog with her stocking, the dog with her Christmas bandana, the dog investigating wrapped presents to see if any are for her. These aren't official White House photographs for public relations. These are personal family photos, the kind any dog-obsessed family would take. By Christmas 1990, Millie has had puppies. In March of that year, she gave birth to 6 puppies in the White House, and the entire nation followed the saga like it was a royal birth. The puppies were named by Bush family members: Spot, Barney, Dido, Headstrong, Eastside, and Turbo. 2 of the puppies, Spot and Barney, would later become White House dogs themselves during George W. Bush's presidency, which is a nice bit of continuity. So Christmas 1990 features not just Millie's stocking, but stockings for the puppies too. 6 additional dog stockings hanging in the White House. Barbara Bush filling them with appropriate puppy-sized treats. The logistics alone are absurd, but the Bushes commit fully to the bit. George Bush himself is less obsessed with the dogs than Barbara is, but he's certainly fond of Millie. There are photos of him in the Oval Office with Millie lying on the floor nearby, or walking with Barbara and Millie on the White House grounds. He's dealing with the Gulf War buildup in late 1990, preparing for Operation Desert Storm, having to make impossible decisions about military action. And then he comes home and there's his wife making sure the puppies have Christmas stockings. There's something genuinely grounding about that contrast. The weight of the presidency, the enormous decisions, the knowledge that your choices will determine whether people live or die. And then a dog in a Christmas bandana, puppies investigating their stockings, Barbara laughing as the dogs make a mess of wrapping paper. Christmas 1991, the Gulf War is over, Bush's approval ratings are sky high, and the family Christmas at Camp David that year includes Millie and several of her now grown puppies. The Bush grandchildren play with the dogs. Someone definitely gives Millie a new toy, probably a stuffed Santa or a plush Christmas tree that she promptly destroys. The Bushes are relentlessly normal people in many ways, which is kind of refreshing. They're not trying to be glamorous like the Kennedys. They're not particularly formal or stuffy. They're just a family that really loves their dog and happens to live in the White House. Barbara wears her signature fake pearls everywhere and doesn't care about high fashion. George genuinely likes being around his grandchildren. They're comfortable in a way that makes all the dog stocking stuff feel natural rather than performed. By Christmas 1992, Bush has lost re-election to Bill Clinton. It's his final Christmas in the White House, and there's that bittersweet quality to lame duck holidays. The family gathers, probably more aware than usual that this is the last time they'll celebrate Christmas in this particular house. Millie gets her stocking as usual. The grandchildren are there. Everyone's trying to be cheerful despite the election loss. And you know what? Millie doesn't care about election results. Millie just knows it's Christmas and there are treats and her people are together, which is kind of the perfect energy for the Bush's final White House Christmas. After leaving office, George and Barbara move back to Houston, and Millie comes with them, obviously. She lives until 1997, spending her final years as a regular dog rather than the most famous dog in America. But those White House Christmases with stockings hung and presents opened and puppies running around, those are preserved in photos and in Millie's book and in the memories of everyone who visited the Bush White House and saw a dog with her own Christmas stocking. So tonight, as you drift off, imagine this scene. Christmas morning in the White House, early 1990s. Barbara Bush in her robe and pearls. George probably already dressed in a suit because that's just who he is. 12 or so grandchildren of various ages running around. And Millie tail wagging frantically, investigating a Christmas stocking hung just for her, filled with treats because she's a very good dog and deserves Christmas presents. Imagine the normalcy of it. The refusal to be too serious or too formal, even in the most formal house in America. The commitment to treating the family dog like family, complete with Christmas traditions. Because sometimes the most human thing a president can do is hang a stocking for the family dog. And speaking of modern presidents creating warm traditions for children, let's talk about a storytime tradition that became must-see holiday television. Obama reading The Night Before Christmas to children each year. So let's talk about Barack Obama and one of the most purely wholesome traditions of his presidency, reading The Night Before Christmas to children every year, with different dramatic interpretations and perfect comedic timing, creating videos that became holiday classics. Obama becomes president in January 2009 as the first African American president in U.S. history, which is enormously significant and comes with incredible pressure and scrutiny. He's 47 years old, has 2 young daughters, Malia and Sasha, and brings to the presidency a very specific energy. Intellectual, measured, but also warm and funny in ways that surprise people who only saw him in serious speeches. The tradition of Obama reading The Night Before Christmas starts in 2009, his first Christmas as president. The plan is simple: gather some children, have the president read them the famous Clement Clark Moore poem, film it for the internet, release it as a holiday greeting. Standard presidential, wholesome content. Except Obama commits to the bit in a way nobody expected. He doesn't just read the poem, he performs it. Different voices for different characters, dramatic pauses, gestures, full theatrical interpretation. He's enjoying himself immensely, and you can tell. The 2009 video features Obama sitting with a group of children at the National Building Museum in Washington, D.C. He's reading from a large illustrated book, and the kids are clearly mesmerized. When he gets to "'Twas the Night Before Christmas," and all through the house, he does this thing with his voice where it becomes storytelling voice rather than presidential voice. Softer, more intimate, more grandfatherly despite being only in his 40s. The kids react to his reading. When he does Santa's voice, "Happy Christmas to all and to all a good night," he goes jolly and deep, and you can see the children grin. This isn't Obama reading words at children. This is Obama actively entertaining them, making the poem come alive, using all his considerable charisma in service of a children's story. Michelle Obama appears in some of these videos too, and the dynamic between them is lovely. She's clearly amused by how much her husband is enjoying this. There's this moment in one video where Barack does a particularly dramatic reading of a line, and Michelle just smiles and shakes her head slightly like, "This is who I married, a man who cannot read a children's poem without performing." 2010, the tradition continues. This time, Obama is even more comfortable with the performance aspect. He's leaning into the drama, really playing up certain lines. The children watching are different kids than the previous year, but their reactions are similar. Delight, engagement, the kind of attention children give when they're genuinely entertained. What makes these videos particularly effective is that Obama never breaks character into presidential mode. He stays in storytelling mode the entire time. He's not thinking about healthcare reform or Afghanistan or the economy. He's just a guy reading a poem to children, and he's going to make it the best reading possible. By 2011, people are anticipating these videos. They've become a holiday tradition not just for the Obama family, but for people who watch them online. Comment sections filled with people talking about how much they look forward to the president's reading, how it's become part of their family's Christmas routine to watch Obama read the night before Christmas. The 2012 reading is particularly good. Obama's timing has improved. He knows exactly when to pause for effect, when to speed up for excitement, when to go quiet for suspense. He's been doing this for 4 years now, and he's genuinely skilled at it. The children watching are completely absorbed, which is the highest compliment you can give a storyteller. There's something remarkable about watching the most powerful person in the world reading a children's poem with total commitment and zero self-consciousness. No irony, no winking at the adults in the room. Just pure, genuine effort to entertain children and preserve Christmas magic. 2013, his second term. Malia and Sasha are teenagers now, probably slightly embarrassed by their dad's dramatic Christmas poem readings, as teenagers should be. But Obama continues the tradition. Different location, different children, same enthusiastic performance. What's interesting is how these videos work as historical documents. Decades from now, people will watch these and see not just a president performing a duty, but a man genuinely enjoying himself. They'll hear the poem read with care and creativity. They'll see children of all backgrounds gathered around, listening, believing. 2014, 2015, the tradition holds. Every year, Obama finds time in his December schedule to sit down with children and read the night before Christmas. Every year, he brings the same energy, the same dramatic flair, the same clear joy in the performance. By 2016, his final year in office, there's a bittersweet quality to the video. This is the last time President Obama will read The Night Before Christmas as president. The children watching don't know this is historical. They just know the president is reading them a story and doing funny voices. Obama reads, "'Twas the night before Christmas, and all through the house, not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. And for 3 or 4 minutes, nothing else matters. Not politics, not policy, not the fact that his presidency is ending. Just the poem, the children, the magic of a story well told. The videos are still online. You can watch all of them right now if you want. People do every Christmas. They've become as much a part of the holiday media landscape as Rudolph or Frosty. And they work because Obama understood something fundamental. Reading to children matters. Making them laugh matters. Taking time from running the country to perform a poem for kids matters. So tonight, as you drift off, imagine Obama in whatever room they filmed these videos, probably sitting in a nice chair, children cross-legged on the floor around him, camera crew trying to stay quiet. Imagine him opening the book, clearing his throat, and launching into the poem with full theatrical commitment. Imagine the children's faces, the way they lean forward during exciting parts, the way they smile when he does Santa's voice, the way they're completely present in the moment, not thinking about anything except the story being told. And imagine Obama himself taking a break from everything else, the weight of the presidency, the constant scrutiny, the enormous decisions to just be a storyteller, to create a few minutes of pure joy for children, to maintain the magic of Christmas, one dramatic reading at a time. Because sometimes the most important thing you can do is read to children like you mean it. Even if you're the president, even if you have a million other things to do. And now, let this thought carry you gently into sleep. And that brings us to the end of our journey through presidential Christmases. From George Washington distributing cloth and coins at Mount Vernon, to the Adamses shivering in an unfinished White House, to Lincoln writing letters of comfort during the nation's darkest hours. From Grant making Christmas official, to Roosevelt's children staging a tree rebellion, to Coolidge lighting a tree for an entire nation. From FDR maintaining traditions through Depression and war, to Eisenhower painting cards by hand, to Kennedy creating nutcracker magic for his children. These weren't perfect people. They made mistakes, faced impossible choices, lived in times we can barely imagine. But they also hung stockings, decorated trees, wrote letters to children, and tried to create moments of joy when everything else was falling apart. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, remember this: even presidents, with all their power and problems and impossible decisions, still made time for Christmas, still believed that warmth and tradition and small acts of kindness mattered. And if they could find reasons to celebrate in the middle of wars and depressions and national crises, maybe we can too. Sleep well and Merry Christmas.